Good evening, everyone. I'm David Selberg, CEO at Hospice of Santa Barbara. We have over 1,000 folks signed up to be with us tonight participating, and from all across the world, countries such as Argentina to Zimbabwe. So I'd like to thank all of you for being with us tonight. We're deeply grateful. And a very, very special thank you to some of our lead sponsors. That would be the Natalie Orfila Foundation and Lou Buglioli, the Ridley Tree Cancer Center, the Santa Barbara Foundation. These are all leading sponsors supporting the entire Illuminate Speakers series. So thank you to all of them. And now I have the pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague at Hospice of Santa Barbara, Charles Caldwell. Charles?
Thanks, David. It's great to be here tonight. Really looking forward to hearing Dr. Miller's talk. As many of you know, Hospice of Santa Barbara is a local nonprofit. We've been serving families coping with grief or life-threatening illness for the past 45 years. Our motto is compassionate care, freely given. And that reflects that all of our services are offered completely free to the families who come to us. It's 100% supported by community donations. During this pandemic, we created the Illuminate Speaker Series as a free offering to address the widespread anxiety and unrest and struggle that people were feeling out in the world. However, this is only made possible through your support. So if you feel so moved and you'd like to ensure the future of this series, please consider making a donation today by visiting our website.
Thank you so much, Charles. And now I have the pleasure, everyone, to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Dr. B.J. Miller. Dr. B.J. Miller is an established thought leader in the area of serious illness, end-of-life issues, and death. He has been a physician for 19 years and has counseled over 1,000 patients and family members. His 2015 TED Talk, What Really Matters at the End of Life, has been viewed over 12 million times. BJ's latest project, Mettle Health, that's METTLE Health, aims to provide personalized, holistic consultations for patients, caregivers, and clinicians who need help navigating the practical and the emotional issues that come with serious illness and disability. So without further ado, we present to you Dr. B.J. Miller. B.J.?
Thank you, David. It's such a pleasure to see you, and thanks so much for having me. Guys, this is an extra lovely night for me, in part because Santa Barbara has been my home. It's where I did my residency, and I just had the weirdly dumb cosmic luck to end up there at the same time Michael Carney came to town, which for someone who's had a burgeoning interest in hospice and palliative care, or nascent, to be able to work alongside Michael is something it's sort of just, I don't know how to say it. I mean, ridiculously good fortune for me. And so a lot of the things I'm going to talk about tonight are really passed on to me through Michael. So I don't know that I have anything original here to share, but maybe some new ways of fashioning old ideas. We'll see. But with that, let me jump into my slide deck here, guys. The title for me tonight is Let It Fall. That is maybe a little provocative because a lot of us, that may be a little oversimplified. But one of the points I want to make just right out of the chute here is that I think many of us know that in life, so much of the hardship, so much of the pain can come from resisting what's happening. And sometimes the answer is to just let it go. Not always. Again, that's an overly pat statement. But I want to focus in on existential issues tonight, things that otherwise get short shrift in healthcare. And in this way, an existential crisis can be very painful, but can be cathartic. And if we let it fall, whether by force or by choice, with enough time and support, we often get to see who we are underneath all this stuff, these accomplishments, the doing. So it's a precious opportunity that most of us wouldn't wish for, but when it comes, there's a lot in it to mine. So, and this is just a Francis Bacon painting, a triptych, guys, that I just love his work, but he also helps me kind of make the point of disintegration, of how humans can come apart in so many ways. And I want to start, if you'll forgive me, I know all of you maybe know what palliative care is, but I try to start most talks with just reminding us what this field is and what it isn't, because a lot of us just continue to get it wrong. So I will just shut up for a second and let everyone read it, and then I'll make a few points. Okay. Well, a few things to say right out of the chutes. And again, this is more of a public service announcement than anything else. So it's reminding each other what's behind so much of the work we do in hospice. So palliative care, first of all, hospice is a subset of palliative care. Palliative care is a larger purview. You'll see in this definition has nothing to do with end of life. A lot of people get palliative care well in advance of death. The most interesting things about this definition are that the patient and family are included, that is, oftentimes in the rest of healthcare, the family can maybe feel sort of an tacked on piece. There's no place for them to sit in hospitals. There's sort of an afterthought. Whereas in palliative care, we know that none of us is alone. None of us is fully autonomous, that we are affected by our relationships. And so, of course, that's part of our care too. Otherwise, the other phrases here, quality of life, as a pursuit, as a goal, as a powerful goal. And suffering as well, a powerful fulcrum around which to revolve our care. Both of these things, it must be said, are subjective. And one of the things I love so much about our field together is that we get to lean into people's experiences on their terms, that we're not holding out some notion of objective truth to which we compare each other. Are you falling short of, especially those of us in the disability world? We know this sort of vague frame of reference as this normal, healthy person often means that we come up short. But if we embrace the subjective experience where we become our own frame of reference, at least some of our suffering won't be because we're comparing ourselves to people outside of ourselves. So there's something very powerful about the subjective world, about suffering. And also because, well, let me cut to this next slide here, guys. I mean, the thing about suffering that's so fascinating is everyone does it. There is, I don't think there's a person alive who has not suffered. In fact, first thing we do out of a womb, if we're healthy, if we're well, is wail. There's something elemental about attention within our existence. And so it's wonderful work to do together because we're working, sure, on behalf of our patients and families, but in so doing, we're working on ourselves as well, because we're all invited to this particular party. No one's inside or outside. No one's outside. We're all inside this circle. So another thing I love to say about palliative care is, if you go back a second real quick here, guys, couldn't you just scribble, cross out the words palliative care and put in the words healthcare? I mean, shouldn't all of healthcare do this? The truth is, of course, it doesn't. And there does need to be a subspecialty called palliative care, hospice and palliative medicine, to kind of make up the difference. But if we had our way, over time, all of healthcare would remember that all the work it's doing ostensibly should relate back to the patient and their family and should have something to do with mitigating their pain and suffering and optimizing their quality of life. Otherwise, what the heck are we doing? So, all right, with some of that out of the way as sort of a foundation together, guys, let's dip into this, a couple of things on this wheel of suffering. So no one person, no one discipline has a lock on what it means to suffer. Like I was saying, everyone's an expert on this one. So ultimately, our work together is multidisciplinary. Of course, doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, but volunteers, music thanatologists, art therapists, you name it. Writ large, whose work doesn't touch upon the human experience? So it's a big, big tent. Hopefully, one of the ways it's so fun to have a conversation like this is, yeah, the clinical piece is wonderful, but a lot of the action is outside of the clinic, especially on a couple of planes I want to talk about tonight. So one is I've added this logistical piece at the lower right, you see, because I just want to make the point that it's something that we all feel, but it needs to be stated that sometimes this healthcare system upon which we rely and in which we work, sometimes, despite good intentions, the healthcare system ends up being the source of suffering. And that needs to be stated. That gets at how we burn out. That gets at many issues. And I just name this logistical suffering. We suffer in ways, sort of in practical ways, in daily ways. We suffer with our when our logistics don't match our reality. So we can say a little bit more about that, but mostly I want to focus on this existential plane. I think in general, existential distress gets sort of short shrift. I often hear that phrase used specifically for people who are facing death or people who are neurotic. That it's almost like a luxury to have an existential crisis, as though it's not essential. It's just something on the side if you have a spare time. I totally disagree with that. I don't think there's a bigger effort that a human being undertakes in a lifetime, but to find meaning in their life or to make meaning in their life. And I think that's really what an existential crisis is a crisis of meaning. And hopefully we can have many of those crises along the course of our lifetimes before the big one, before we're nearing the end of our lives. I say that because it's such a fruitful, if painful, process. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more here. But that's what I mostly want to focus on tonight in our time. So when we say existential stuff, I mean, one of the main meanings should come to mind, but also, sort of it often shows up in this little three-letter word, why? Why is this happening? Why am I suffering? Why did I get this disease? Why didn't I get the disease? Survivor's guilt. Put another way, Nietzsche, Viktor Frankl, Michael Carney, many others have said, big brains have said things like, give me a why, and I can go through, I can put up with anything if I have a why. Many different ways of saying that same message. And I feel that in my own life. I can put up with all sorts of stuff if I know why I'm doing it. But so often the why is elusive, especially within healthcare. That existential crisis thing, I would say that an existential crisis is the most common diagnosis in any physician's office. It may not get called that, but my guess is that would be underneath just about every disease or every illness or every condition. So, some of the problem, as I'm more than hinting here, has come from healthcare itself. And we can trace some of this back to mid-19th century. So this is a painting by William Prosperi called Ether Day. And it's a depiction of a moment in 1846 where ether was harnessed as an anesthetic to put a person to sleep so we could operate on that person. So great news. I mean, huge advance, wonderful thing. I mean, those of us who have had surgery on ourselves, thank the gods for anesthesia. The alternative was biting on a stick and some vodka. I think we've come a long way. But so this is mid-19th century, industrial revolution, technology revolution, and this medicine and science were getting in bed together, which was relatively new. And then we sort of get this mad dash for objectivity, for reproducibility, for the scientific method. There's a lot to say about that. And much has come from that approach to care in the last 170 years. But it's come at some expense. You can sort of see in this depiction here, like, in a way, this allowed us to kind of separate the person from the personality or the person from the body. Or in a way, we could get the person out of the way and fiddle with the body. And it allowed us to focus on the disease as the thrust of healthcare, of medicine. And that made some sense. And it allowed us to get pretty far in some interesting ways. But this model held out that disease was anomalous and that was pathological, aberrant. And so if we fight hard enough, we think hard enough, we can root it out and beat it out of us and get back to normal, happy life. So that, as a convention, there's some problems with that. And as a disabled person, I've felt this all the time, where I'm made to feel broken, even though disability, disease, illness, death, as we all know, is just normal. It's not inherently pathological. but we confuse our conventions with reality all the time, and never more obviously than in medicine. So in this way, you can see how we sort of specialized our way to, subspecialized our way. And Michael wrote a beautiful article a long time ago now that I called "Palliative Care, Just Another Subspecialty?" Where we question this idea of approaching a body, a human, as simply a body made up of parts. So in this way, subspecialization was a process of disintegration. And over time, we've gotten so subspecialized that we take people apart, but we're not so good at putting them back together again or helping people come back together again. And so we have a lot of people who may be fixed or cured, but are no longer whole. And this poses a lot of problems to our sense of self or identity in the world. And it gets at, this is an important distinction to make here. So curing different from healing. So curing, that's great. I mean, hey, I'm all for fixing things that can be fixed much of the time, when they can be fixed. But the problem is not everything is fixable. And eventually, none of us is fixable. That's not a failure. That is normal life. And unfortunately, healthcare sort of stopped at the curing moment. So when we say things like, I'm so sorry, Mr. Jones, there's nothing more we can do. And, not my department. But as poor healthcare, I mean, in some ways we ask so much of this darn system. It's become our church, it's become our family, and all sorts of problems end up in an emergency room. Part of that's our own fault for marketing ourselves too much and saying, happily saying all that we can do without owning up what we can't do. But, I think the good news here is there's another rubric, there's another way to proceed beyond curing, beyond the moment of cure. And that's the idea of healing. That root simply means of being whole. So, with time and love, I, as a dismembered person, came to become whole again. And a lot of us will know people who are dying who managed to feel whole again. So even when we're beyond the fix, we may be healable. Another thing I love about that distinction is not only is it almost always possible, but it also has a way of relying on an engagement with the patient. Whereas in the curing mode, the job of the patient, I have felt this many times, which is basically to sit still and let the curing happen at me, sort of care at me. When healing is the goal, well, then I have to engage. I really do have to engage as the person, as the individual. That is a dance between provider and patient, between two human beings. And this is a lovely way that our field sort of levels the playing field. Another way of getting at this, and let me check the clock here, guys. Another way of some other issues to tease out within this existential plane is acute versus chronic. I mean, the acute mode, which is where a lot of the resources in healthcare go, our hospitals, our acute care centers. We've developed the acute care stuff because it's so dang sexy. That's where cures can happen or not. Chronic care almost implicitly sort of suggests that whatever's going on is not fixable. And so right out of the chutes, we're sort of second-class citizens within the world of healthcare. And you can tell by the structures. We don't have a lot of support for issues that happen over time. We have a lot of support for the acute issues. And that is the difference. I mean, the chronic chronos, time is the difference. So in the acute care mode, it can be transactional. How you go about doing it does seem less important on some level. But as soon as we're into something that happens over time, longitudinally or chronically, well, then it becomes an experience. And an experience is something that's conditioned by our behavior, by our attitude, by our mood, by our environment, etc. It's a much richer zone, but it's a much harder zone to control. And perhaps that's why we in healthcare have shied away from it. But I think one of the things the pandemic is showing us, and there's our aging population, the truth of aging, is that not everything's fixable, and that healthcare has to think of itself beyond just the cure, beyond just the transaction. And this is where things like bedside manner no longer are just a nicety on the side, but become essential. All right. It's another sort of notion that comes out of the existential thinking, which is, it is something to say, a lot of, especially in our world of palliative care or hospice, but in healthcare in general, that people come to us when something has gone wrong. And in so many ways, our job is to help things be less wrong, less hard, less horrible. And that's a pretty mighty mission. But for our own sake, everyone's sake, I think we should also learn to keep an eye out where we can participate in life being more amazing, more wonderful, that we should be able to capture that, not capture that awe, but point to it, highlight it, work with it. And also, of course, to note out this isn't a linear relationship. The suffering, it turns out, is actually a pretty important experience, not just one to wish out of our lives, but we learn a lot from suffering. So by focusing on the hard stuff, by moving through things we wouldn't have known we could do, by tending to suffering by itself, that can be a route to realizing how amazing life actually is. So there's a tension between all of this, and it's one that I think we should keep an eye out for. In other words, sort of lift our gaze above the horizon and keep an eye out for where life can be amazing, not just hard. Here too, guys, just another note that the world of meaning isn't just a verbal world. We put a lot of emphasis on words, like advanced directives. If you can state your wishes, well, then you have some chance that they'll be followed. But if you can't state them in words, well, anything goes. Well, that's not quite fair, right? I mean, I think we know most communication happens in a nonverbal way, and most of the meaning we get made that we make from our lives comes through intuition, from gut sense, from a felt sense, not just language per se. So in the existential plane, in the world of hospice and palliative medicine, I think we can lead the charge in healthcare for helping each other experience life beyond our words and beyond the intellect, which points me to this woman, Florence Nightingale. So she wrote this book in the late 19th century, same time as technology's running away, the scientific method, et cetera, we're going to sort of try hard and fix everything. But she resisted that gospel to some degree. If you read this book, she points us to this word. She doesn't use this word, but she points us to it, which is the world of the senses, the felt world, the perceived world. It's one of my favorite ideas, notions, things, is the whole aesthetic dimension. And I think it's the least tended to in healthcare. In fact, we have a field they're called anesthesia, which is the antonym of the aesthetic. As a patient, again, maybe the most I can hope for, especially in a hospital, is numbness. Forget like the majesty of perception, of feeling. And it's another one of the things we do sort of backwards in this country in some ways. So especially towards the end of life, when our body is so precious and poignant, when we're so in touch with what we're losing, and as we lose the body, we lose this potential to feel things. So I just want to point us to, in terms of meaning making, absolutely, but also just in terms of the majesty of life, I think we should tend to the world of aesthetics. And it's not just the pretty stuff, it's just the felt universe. I hope we'll hear more and more about a word like aesthetics in our work. As I said, so this sort of intuition, felt sense, perceptions, words too, of course, they can go into this meaning-making process that we go through. But I also want to make a plug here. That meaning usually is sort of a narrative. And I love the aesthetic plane because it's sort of pre-verbal, pre-narrative. Before you've strung together a bunch of thoughts and ideas, before you process your experience through your intellect, you still have the world of sensation. So for those of us who are living with dementia or will be living through dementia, cognitive decline, in other words, when we're losing the power of our intellect, I just want to remind ourselves that there's life beyond our intellect. And you can find it, among other places, in the world of the senses. You don't need to have a thought to have a feeling. And you don't need to have much time to have the experience of a sensation. So there's a lot of poignancy to that world. And I just want to put in a plug for meaninglessness. I can't always find meaning. I can't always string it together. But that doesn't mean that life doesn't have value. In fact, some of my favorite moments are I can't discern a purpose to them at all. Like riding a bicycle is one of my favorite feelings. It's an aesthetic feeling. Never mind as transportation or exercise. I just love the feeling. I don't know that it has a purpose, but its own. Something really powerful about that. So next up, I just want to make a little, this is my slide I just used to nod to mystery, to not knowing. And I think a lot of us, especially as we do work around end of life, We have to have some relationship to all that we don't know. Another sort of counterpoint to the rest of medicine, which is so hell-bent on knowing. But the smartest person in this room will tell us there's plenty we don't know. That doesn't mean we shouldn't make space for it. In fact, mystery and not knowing keeps us curious, keeps us humble, keeps us looking. So we should all make some space for all the stuff we don't know. Here, guys, a few more slides just to sort of round out this existential experience and the work we can do within that existential domain. I would say another way of putting, like, I don't know that there's anything more important that we can do in our own lives or with each other, but to help each other find perspective. It's why I studied art in college, which ended up being really good preparation for medicine, for work in medicine, which is learning how to see, how to look. We human beings have a remarkable capacity to shift, to zoom in and out of life, to change our frame of reference, to change how we see. So just want to make this, I just love these, there's 3 slides to kind of make this point. Well, right here, it's a beautiful shot of Earth, right, from space. It's a single thing, one thing. And then by this image, we are all one, right? And that's true, we can see it right there. Or as human beings, we can zoom out. We can see our one world among a zillion. And that is also true. Or we can zoom in. This is an electron microscopy photograph of virus particles. If you zoom in on a human body, any one of us is a universe hosting trillions of life forms. It's kind of stunning. So all 3 of these images are real, are accurate. They're all true. And that we as human beings, that this perhaps our greatest talent is that we can change our perspective. We can change how we see things. And that's the more durable way. If you want to change your world or change your reality, change how you see it. That's accessible to us humans just about any old time. And in this way, we can change our frame of reference. Working with patients and families in this zone, very often this is the work. They feel kicked out of their life by a diagnosis, but changing the frame of reference, zooming in or out, we can often hit upon a different frame in which they now belong again and can inhabit their own life again. Last few slides here are sort of takeaways, what you can learn from existential crises. One is the power of bearing witness. That there's no more important thing that we do than just see people for who they are, for all that they are, and not see someone missing something, not judging what we're seeing. We're very good at noting contrast, and to be seen is there's grace in that. It's one of the kindest things we can do for each other is to see each other entirely, but stop short of that reflex to then go on and judge the differences that we see. If we can just, sort of let ourselves discern, but watch ourselves with the judgment, we live in a kinder world. None of us would feel so dang alone. And it's not that hard to do. We just have to look. We just have to dare to look, dare to not run away, and dare to not judge. Another thing that comes up within the existential frame is just the power of impossibility, how important it is to note when things are just out of reach. We don't like to say that, especially here in the Bay Area in the West. Anything's possible. We can do anything. I mean, maybe humans can, maybe eventually we can, but in an individual life, no, there's plenty that's not possible. And eventually that's not so much a sorrow-making fact as actually a relief. The sort of tyranny of choice, too many choices, especially false choices, has happened in medicine, futile efforts to treat, etc. So letting impossible things be impossible allow human beings to then move on to adapting. And adapting is one of those things that humans do very, very well. When we bump up against something that's impossible and we can call it impossible, well, then we'll find different ways through. That's where we get very industrious and very creative. An architect does not start drawing a building with a blank sheet of paper. They've got gravity, the limitations of materials, et cetera, to work with. And those are useful things. Those impossibilities are useful. And the last thing to say about it is we're innocent. When something's impossible, we're innocent. There's no failing at it. This leads me to this simple saying here. I just want to note one of the things that happens in, is like we said, this sort of disintegration that happens. Is we sometimes do that with our language. this idea of putting the before a word, the homeless, the poor, the dying. This is a rhetorical trick that we use to separate ourselves from those people. So watch yourself when you say the dying, because we're all dying, in some real ways. So we shouldn't separate ourselves from each other where it's not the truth. So watch our language. This is a camp we all belong in. Last couple slides here. I know I keep saying that, but this is one that's very near and dear to me. This phrase here, the myth of independence. So when I became a disabled person in college, I had this. There's the pain of the injuries, etc. But the biggest pain, or perhaps maybe the biggest pain, was this idea that I had to leave the language, the sort of structures of society had me thinking that I had to leave the world of independent people and go over to that uglier world of where the dependent people hang out. And it took me a while to see the truth. And the truth is independence should have a little asterisk next to it. There's no such thing. I don't know that a fully independent person, that is someone who needs nothing from no one, I don't think that person has ever lived. And by the way, wouldn't that be a lonely lot? So the truth is we're all on the spectrum between some complete dependency to a complete total independence. We're all somewhere on that spectrum throughout our entire lives. We move around it a few inches here and there, but it's the same dang spectrum. It's the same truth of life. And I think it's really important to state that, again, so we don't artificially separate ourselves from each other or separate parts of ourselves from the other. Grief is good. I put this in parentheses because it just feels like right now, it feels to me like the most important human muscle to flex is the muscle of grief. It's not one we've been very well versed in here in the West, and one that maybe we're getting a crash course on now. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit more later. But just to say, coming out of existential crisis, you need to have a transitional period where you're processing, metabolizing what's lost and realizing what you still have. And that process is grief. And it is essential not to be shortchanged. Okay, well, this is actually the last slide. And I try to end a lot of talks on this one. I love this image. It's a painting called Et in Arcadia Ego from the 17th century, Nicolas Poussin. So Et in Arcadia Ego, that's Latin for I too exist in paradise. That is what's, you can't probably see it, but that's what's inscribed on this sarcophagus. So you've got these happy campers strolling through paradise, and they happen on a sarcophagus, a tomb. And you can see this sort of quizzical look on their eyes, and they're looking at this goddess figure who, I'm not sure who that's meant to be. Maybe Minerva, I'm not sure. But they're kind of pointing at this inscription, like what is sort of implying, what the heck is this tomb doing in paradise? And what does the sarcophagus mean? And Et in Arcadia, I too exist in paradise. It's purposely in the present tense. It's not a memorial. It's not I was here. It is I am here. And Poussin was a Christian man and did a lot of liturgical painting. So you might interpret this as that spirit exists, that continues. That there's everlasting life in this way. I choose to see it as an agnostic, as someone who is making the point here that death is in fact part of life, even at its most elegiac, at its most amazing, at its most paradisical. Death still exists. It has something to do with how we experience joy in paradise. It is part of a complete life, not this thing that steals life. And that doesn't always feel that way, but I do think of that as a fact of nature that is ours to learn and ours to embody. And a lot of us get to experience that process in hospice work one way and another. So if that doesn't allow us to somehow love death, I don't know that we need to love, like get excited for death. At least maybe we can find a way to love reality in all that it includes, and it certainly includes death. All right, guys. Well, with that little run through, I'm going to kick it back to you, David. Over to you, pal.
Thank you so much, BJ, for your thoughts and your heart and sharing. We're deeply grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Now I have the pleasure to introduce members of our panel who represent truly the best of our Santa Barbara community. They include Joyce Dudley. Joyce is the district attorney of Santa Barbara County, and she's on our board of directors at Hospice of Santa Barbara. Also, I have Dr. Michael Carney with us this evening. He is the medical director of palliative care consultation services at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. That's our regional medical center in the area. So I now turn it over to you, Joyce. Please take it away and thank you.
Thank you. Oh boy, I have 100 questions and 20 minutes. But I think I want to start with the last thing you said, BJ. Death doesn't steal life. Please say more.
Well, I think, and it certainly can feel that way. I want to be very clear. The way this feels from a distance, and we can talk the rhapsodic and poetical about this thing called death. But I want to be very clear. The feelings, the perspective making and meaning and all that may be short, that may not do justice to how it actually feels. And certainly it can feel like death is robbing us of life. But that is our feeling. The truth is that life includes death. Life relies on death. Life wouldn't exist without death. It is a package deal as far as we can tell. So even if our language in those moments, it may feel otherwise, it feels important to remind each other that this is part of life, that they are one and the same. And therefore, we may be less tempted to feel that our death was unfair or that we were robbed by it.
And can you expand that, BJ? You talk about the role of family. Mm-hmm. When a family member has experienced the death of a loved one, it does feel as if a life has been stolen. Yeah. How can you expand upon that so family members also don't feel life has been stolen, but rather just the opposite, that it's part?
Well, I think reminding each other in this way is one, to sort of because we are heady creatures, and having sort of the right constructs in place to catch us, to capture our thoughts, to hold us. That's one way. I think a bigger answer to your question, Joyce, was that slide is grief. That grief is a sort of metabolic process where everything goes in, we get to feel anything, all sorts of crazy, surreal feelings, hard feelings, many, many feelings, where you can feel as people who are living on, we can feel ourselves sort of this thing that was ripped out of us, and this process of finding a way to get back to whole again. So I think of grief as this transitional zone, this metabolic process. And that's where I think the bigger answer to your question is we can be with each other, hold each other as we move through coming to terms with the life of the individual, with this big cosmic life that we're part of, which is all life. This individual life, I will die, this body will die, life will go on, but this body has to go. And we have to find a way to reconcile both of those facts of life, and grief, for my money, is the way to do that.
What is the nexus between grief and suffering?
Well, I think, let's see here. I think grief is a way of responding to suffering, is a way of making sense of your suffering, is a way of noting what you've just gone through, noting all that you're losing or have lost, being true today, but holding you in a way that allows your eyes to stay open. Then eventually you can come to see what you still have. And eventually you can come around to appreciating life that you've ever had. I lost my sister, 20 years ago. And eventually, thanks to grief, I got to a place where I didn't feel it was a pure loss. I got to see the truth that I got 29 years with her. So, gosh, if my choices were 29 years or zilch, I'll take 29 years any day, and that if I had tried to go right to that kind of a statement and actually mean it, I couldn't have. But with time and love and support and enough pointing me back to the realities of life, I got there. And so I guess my answer to your question is that suffering and grief go together in a way. Grief is a way to pull out of the suffering and reconcile your reality and inhabit your reality.
Okay, one last question for you, and then I'm going to go on to my friend Michael. You talked about joy and suffering and grief. The Book of Joy, the conversations between Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. What I got out of that book is that if you haven't experienced great suffering, then you really don't experience great joy. And there is a very strong nexus between the two. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the relationship between suffering and joy.
Yeah, well, thanks. That gets at a little bit of that in Poussin painting. You don't get one without the other. We are wired as relative critters. We understand in our relative way. Absolutes are hard to touch upon. They may well exist, but most of our experience is in the relational one, the relative one. So I'm reminded, I get joy is sweeter now because I know what the absence of joy feels like. And if I didn't have that wide range of experiences, I think I would blow past joy all the time. So the tension between these sort of positive and negatives allow us to sort of locate ourselves in relationship to these extremes over time. And that's set me up to appreciate these experiences while I'm having them. I mean, my goal of joy is if I've suffered enough, if I've opened my eyes enough, I might be able to get to this place where I can appreciate something without having to lose it. But meanwhile, the specter of loss is what helps me feel and know that I have gained.
I love that expression you used. If I haven't suffered, I would blow past joy. I think all of us can feel exactly what you're talking about. If we haven't experienced the suffering, then we wouldn't know how incredible the joy can be. So yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Hello, my friend Michael. How are you this evening?
Hi, Joyce. Very good. Thank you.
Good. Let's talk a little bit more about families. Because BJ made a couple of great comments, I think, in the very beginning when he was defining palliative care, and you're our county's palliative specialist. And when we talk about families in his definition of palliative care, he talked about the before and the during and the including. How do you see that? How do you find working with the family and treating the patient and suffering and pain and all of that come together so that when you're having a conversation with someone in their family, you can bring them a sense of the more wonderful?
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. And just before I reply to that question, I just want to acknowledge how lovely it is to be here with BJ this evening. And thank you, BJ, for your lovely, kind words at the start. But the joy was mine when I came here to Santa Barbara 20 years ago, and then had to kind of go through a medical residency again to find myself working alongside you as a senior resident made it all possible, and it was a real joy. So thank you. Joyce, yeah, thank you. One of the very first things I learned when I entered the world, I entered the world of palliative care through the world of hospice, because palliative care didn't actually exist as a specialty when I began working in hospice about 40 years ago. And one of the first lessons that I was taught was that, you know, the unit of care you're going to focus on and attend to is the family. The family is the unit of the care with the person who's the patient at the center. And, you know, as you were asking your question, I was just thinking of this past year and how this has been, you know, what I've witnessed working in the hospital and kind of just seeing the impact of the pandemic and the difficulty, so many levels, you know, so much suffering. But the incredible suffering that came with that because of the restrictions on family visiting, because of the necessity of isolation precautions. And really kind of seeing that suffering in a way, as I understand it, has that multi-dimensional kind of component to it that BJ so beautifully talked about. And it was interesting. I was interested, BJ, then that you really took your focus this evening as the existential, because in a way, if that piece is somehow, if we find our way through that we don't fix existential suffering, but we find a way of living with it and living through it, in a way, not everything else falls into place, but everything else is possible to bear if that piece, that meaning piece, is in place. And I think one of the great sufferings for so many families this past year has been the separation, the isolation, the inability to be with their loved ones when they've been very sick, and especially if they've been, approaching death and they haven't been able to be there. And that suffering, as I've come to understand it, is the inevitable pain that goes with living, experienced in isolation. Whereas if somehow we're experiencing that same pain in relationship, in connection, it's still painful, but it's more bearable. And indeed, that opens up the possibility for meaning. C.S. Lewis wrote this beautiful book after his wife died called A Grief Observed. And one of his phrases is kind of being surprised by joy. But that's one of the surprising realities of being in the presence of suffering that's being lived in relationship, is that joy emerges. We can't prescribe it, but it happens.
No, that was so beautiful, Michael. And I reflect on the sentence, I feel your pain. And whether I'm talking to crime victims whose loved ones have been murdered, or someone who's been sexually assaulted, it's almost as if that becomes a major moment in our communication. They can look into my eyes. I can tell them, I feel your pain, and you can just watch their shoulders drop. Mm-hmm. If you can't be with someone, if you can't have someone feel your pain, it has a terrible effect on that sense of isolation, and your pain grows.
Absolutely.
So thanks for thinking about that.
And just picking up on that, what BJ said about the power of bearing witness, and then the other side of that presence and being witnessed to is the experience of being seen. Mm-hmm. I see you. I really see you, through the labels, through the diagnosis. And if that person feels seen as a person, it's as you say, BJ, so beautifully, it's healing, it's transformative.
BJ, you're a lucky man to have been mentored by Michael. I know you know that.
Luck in my life, yeah, I know.
BJ, I want to shift your focus because you mentioned time a couple of times, and I want you to think about the meaning of time as an existentialist. And one of the sentences you said was, you don't need much time to have the experience, to experience a sensation. Mm-hmm. So tell us more about that.
Well, if one thing to say about time is, and I don't, it's not, I think we think of time as this law, this fact of nature. I mean, it is related to some interplanetary motions and things like that. It is linked to something very large, for sure. But I think it's really important for us to pick up on what Dr. Einstein pointed us to, and that it is a relative phenomenon. It is, in a way, made up. It's one that we make up all the time. And the Greeks knew this too. There was chronos and kairos. There was time in this sort of 1 second after another linear kind of way. And then there was this qualitative experiential relationship to time that didn't march out by the clock per se, but unfurled. And so just getting past, even, I think that alone is kind of eye-opening and wonderful to realize, is this thing that can rule our lives, this tick-tock thing, is also made up in a way. And we may feel this, like there's data around this, like around the experience of a good physician at the bedside. If they sit down, if they make eye contact, like you mentioned, Joyce, with your clients, you know, the patient will swear that the doctor spent more time with them than they actually did.
Yeah.
There's just this qualitative thing. So in so many ways, so much of the good stuff can happen between people. It does not require much time. And I need to remind myself of that a lot in healthcare, where you're just so dang busy. And one more thing on your list is just, because there's no time for it. And to some degree, there's truth in that. But lightening the grip that time has on our daily, controlling our daily lives can be very helpful to allow other things into the moment. And I love the metric or the meter of a moment. It's different from a minute. It's indiscernible, a moment, but it has boundaries around it. It has a beginning and an end, but it's not so chopped up. So much life plays out in this kairos kind of way. And so that's a little backdrop, but even in the more literal sense, like to have a feeling, to sense, to smell something. First of all, takes very little, in the literal sense, takes little time to pass, just to feel it. But it also obliterates time in this normal way too. Like a smell is so powerful for many of us. I got to find the name of this, but there was a perfume my babysitter wore when I was like in first and second grade in St. Louis. And when I walk by someone who wears that perfume, immediately I am transported to that moment. So, go figure. So there's also that aspect of familiarity of touch and sensation and smell pulling us through our lives in various ways and evoking moments in our lives, and becomes a source of memory too. So it's just powerful, wonderful stuff. And I love reminding ourselves that it doesn't take much time.
And it's funny because when you talk about quantitative versus qualitative time, quantitative feels like what goes on in my brain, and quantitative grabs my heart. And you could just feel one of those moments of qualitative time. And wow.
Yeah. Awesome.
Michael, in your work, you often see people who are finding out that they have ALS or cancer, and you're trying to prepare them for the next experience, which could include pain and wonder and everything else. BJ talked about anticipating preventing suffering. How do you anticipate for people who are in the middle of dealing with the biggest shock of their life? How do you help them anticipate, and how do you help them prevent? And then how do you help them accept?
Well, I'm thinking of BJ's phrase, less horrible, more wonderful. And I'm also thinking of a wonderful article which a friend and colleague in Montreal, Balfour Mount, who's in a way the grandfather of palliative care, wrote some years ago called Healing Connections. And so it's about less horrible, more wonderful. It is about kind of the immediate is often dealing with the immediate pain, the immediate difficult symptoms, the immediate shock of a new diagnosis, the logistics. And by the way, I just want to put a little plug in. We haven't really talked about BJ's book this evening. A Beginner's Guide to the End of Life, because this is just an incredible book, an incredible resource for anyone who is beginning on that journey that you're describing, Joyce. And for just a quick example, I know of somebody who called from France because she was over there with her father, who was dying, who was in the middle. She was American. She'd gone over to join him in this alien healthcare system, and she said, well, what one resource could I have that can help me kind of negotiate this? And as well as encouraging her to ask for a palliative care referral in her hospital, I recommended this book to her. And she said it literally made all the difference. So so that kind of practical help, just being made aware of the kind of resources that are there, information, all of that's important. But the reason that I think of Balfour Mount's article, Healing Connections, is that basically what what this extraordinary little piece of research did was it showed that what's transformative at the end of life, and not just at the end of life, but when you're given a serious diagnosis and you're just starting through, partly because there's so much fear around it, unfortunately, we still hear the word cancer, and for example, and we think we have a terminal diagnosis, or we hear ALS and we think we have a terminal diagnosis. But I kind of lost my thread there. What is so fragmenting at a moment like that is fear, and it is so disconnective and contractive. And so what Bal and his colleagues found in this piece of research is that those that could rate their quality of life as good, even in very difficult circumstances, were those who had what they called healing connections. Healing connections within themselves, with others, with the phenomenal world, through the senses, or through ultimate reality. And those that had the greatest existential suffering were those that were fragmented, that were isolated, that were alone. So steps that take care of the fear, information, good symptom management, family meetings, all kinds of support, but also really, I think, helping families, individuals and families, to reflect on what brings you into the deepest experiences of connection.
That's beautiful, Michael. I think of Mr. Rogers saying, look for the helpers during disasters. And I think of you saying, look for the healing connections, seek the healing connections, empower the healing connections. And that's such a beautiful thought. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. BJ, is there anything else you want to add?
Oh gosh, man, there's so much to say. Gosh, I wouldn't hazard to try to add much more, except for thank you on all fronts for this conversation. I guess I wanted to say one more thing, because one word that hasn't made our way into our conversation yet, but is a word that probably sums up all of this, including our jobs, would be love. I think it's true enough to say that our job here, our work together here, is really, that's what we're really trying to do. So I just want to sneak that word in there somewhere.
Oh, it's a great word. David, I'm going to send it back to you, but I'm also going to use the word love because we just started that. I loved this presentation this evening, these two extraordinary doctors. I've enjoyed all of these incredible sessions you put on when we needed it most during COVID. So on behalf of my family, I'd like to donate $1,000 to Hospice and thank you for the great work that you do.
Thank you so very much, Dr. B.J. Miller, Joyce Dudley, and Dr. Michael Carney. We're so blessed to have all of you with us tonight, and we're so grateful. We're pleased, everyone, to be able to offer the Illuminate series for free, but we could not do it without your help, as Joyce just made a generous donation a moment ago. Won't you please consider a donation to ensure the future of this series? Please visit our website, shown here, to sign up for upcoming Illuminate series events. Again, this series is freely offered to everyone, but you do have to pre-register ahead of time, so please do that. And thank you, everyone, for participating tonight, being with us, and have a great rest of your day or evening. Good night.